Well, hello. Welcome to this third in the series of C-DaRE Conversations on Touch. I'm Sara Reed, and we've got Ruth Gibson and Hetty Blades and Karen Wood here today. So we're going to have a nice conversation about touch. We may pick up on some of the things that we talked about before, if I can remember some of those threads. But I'm going to start off with a quote just to get us going, which you may then respond to. So this is from a book called Touch. Touch, the Science of the Sense That Makes Us Human. It's by David J. Linden. And the quote, which I've come back to many times, is touch allows for the powerful effects of life, history, culture and context. Just as a starting point, I don't know if any of you want to pick up on that. Do you want me to say it again?
Yes, please.
Touch allows for the powerful effects of life, history, culture and context. So you may want to respond to that. Maybe that's a philosophical question, Hetty. I don't know. It's or statement, not a question, but statement. We all experience touch in our lives, of course, but we did talk about in the context of lockdown as well, how this has affected us.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that, and how the absence of touch has affected us, and therefore what does that mean in terms of kind of history and culture, and what was the other thing that was in the quote? Life, history, culture
and context.
And context. Because there's been the beginning of lockdown, it felt like there was a grieving of touch, and knowing that it wasn't going to be present, and then now we're coming, or things are easing in a way. There's also a fear of touch. That this whole situation has created. Those are just initial kind of thoughts in response to that quote, and also thinking of what will be the traces and the resonance of the pandemic in terms of touch, and where will we be, where are we going with this? How will it affect us in the future?
And who is
sorry,
who is us? How will it affect us? So who's the us? Ruth, you were going to say something.
Well, I just think it's amazing how everyone's just jumped onto platforms quite readily, and how quickly that's been sort of assimilated into everyone's way of being. And it's quite remarkable, really, that that's happened, because it's the sort of want and need has made that happen without any kind of sort of barrier to entry. Normally the technology would maybe for some people be a barrier to entry, but actually people have thrown themselves into it, which I think is through that not connectedness, or wanting to maintain those the touch. I think about touch in a different way though sometimes than the skin to skin, but I think our life, culture, history and context is very much about how we are adapting to these new ways of working, and trying to find new ways rather than going back to what is normal, because it's never going to be normal from now on. So that's quite interesting, I think. That's just come up from that quote.
And I think the kind of lack of touch in our current context, as we you know, have emerged from the strict kind of lockdown measures, but we are still without touch. I mean, we shouldn't really be touching one another, people outside of our households and so on. And I think, you know, it's quite interesting the way that then different forms of touch emerge, as you're saying, Ruth, that aren't always about skin on skin. And, you know, it's kind of interesting, that social void where you would ordinarily kind of hug or handshake, and what kind of emerges as a way of making touching or making that kind of contact, but without skin on skin. And I think it's kind of interesting, as you say, to kind of reframe then a bit what we think of as touch, or how we think of that idea in a way, partly through platforms and partly through face-to-face where you can't do that.
And those how times changed as well, because it's actually exhausting. What we're doing now is quite exhausting, and looking at the ways in which we, you know, ordinarily absorb things in our own being just by being in the same room, for example, in the same vicinity, and yet we're in this other vicinity that's 2D, and not always 2D, which I'd like to talk about later. But you know, and it's amazing how different that is. And then when we, like you say, when we come back into a place where we could be in the same proximity, in the same place, same context, that actually there's a different trust. It's like a little negotiation, isn't it, between. It's fascinating what's changing, I think, for us. Yeah.
One of the things that was talked about in one of the previous conversations was that, as you say, you just reminded me of that, like people coming together, and there's a sort of dance, there's a sort of choreography, whether it's in the, and we talked about whether it's in the supermarket, whether it's in a room, or it's quite interesting.
Like a different sort of navigation, isn't it? And yeah, negotiation. And I've been, I guess for me, it's just sound has just become so important to me, and I guess, yeah, and the different variations of sound. I think we all realised that at the beginning when we were hearing, you know, nature and the cities and things like that. But it's those, yeah, what's augmented and what's, you know, and what's taken away, and yeah. And sound has that kinesthetic resonance. So, and the vibration, and yeah. So people have been coping remarkably, like audio dance classes, you know, and rather than just having the camera on the, you know, on the body, and the body going through exercises or whatever. Some of the audio classes have been quite astonishing, actually. And we're all, you know, I'm not using headphones, but Karen, you said you're using headphones now, but you're also using headphones, so that's also, you know, yeah, it changes. Bringing attention to whispering. And what that does to us, and our dear ones and our nearest ones, you know.
Yeah, and some of the, I think that's really, that's really the kinesthetic resonance of sound is something that's been really heightened, hasn't it, during this time. And but I also think there is something about physical presence on online platforms. So as we are now, I still feel like there is there's still connection, if you like. So whereas and that, because we are able to hear and we are able to see each other, then that connection has, for this moment, for this time, has replaced the physical presence and the ability to be able to touch you. But yeah, I think that has really kind of settled into I'm just thinking of some of the classes that I've done online, and that have been, you know, that you have had the camera on, that there is something about the togetherness of that that yeah, the social togetherness of that
I
kind
totally
of
agree, and I think that's fantastic. I've been part of one of the MoCo conferences where we did a workshop, and it was just great, you know, getting people off their chairs and moving, and these are non-dancers as well, and gestures. And I think it was really funny because it was like the mistakes made it live, you know, super live. Like people were just really fumbling around, and somehow that was kind of the sort of oxygen of you know, of it being live, and it was sort of hilarious. But actually, I think, Karen, that's great. You know, there's this sort of warmth about that gathering at the same time wherever you're in the world, and that's wonderful. Yeah, I've had some absurd experiences in VR, which have been, again, presenting in VR at a conference, and where you're an abstracted character, where you don't have any legs, in Mozilla Hubs, and your head, when you talk, jiggles around. So you're an abstracted form. You can borrow the sirens. Sorry, living in London. But what was really amazing is the abstract nature of what you looked like in Mozilla Hubs, and you were meeting. You couldn't walk, but you could fly. And when you spoke, you know, your little eyes were like this, and your head would move around in the avatar. But somehow, in the abstraction, there was a frankness about the way in which people were talking to one another. It was really extraordinary. Like, it almost gave people a sort of license, you know, to be really free, actually. So, and there's a lack of touch in that world, even though you can turn around in that space. You're not flat on, you can turn around, you've got spatial sound. So you have the sense of coming towards people and going away. But then you start to realize how, unlike I'm being now, you know, being articulate, and language starts to become massively important through lack of touch, I think.
Say something.
I was thinking about when Ruth and Karen were talking about the kind of embodied practices and engaging in those through the platform. I was thinking back to the article that I think sparked this series. And I reread that recently. It was kind of interesting because that was obviously quite early on in the whole pandemic and the lockdown process, and it was quite interesting to look back on that, kind of where we are now. And I was really struck by this quite haunting image of the body not existing, and the way that she talks about that. And, you know, I found it quite haunting at the time, and still now. But then I was really thinking, and particularly when you were talking about the embodied practices as well, how much the body really does exist still in these kinds of exchanges, albeit in a very different way, but that there's no kind of escaping, if you like, the kind of very physical reality of those shared embodied practices, even when it's happening online. And I guess one other thing that occurred to me about that thinking back to that article now is like how, you know, she talks about the body as weapon, and this very kind of haunting image of like the cough that can kill. And I feel the weight of that reality really strongly in a way, since we've emerged from lockdown and we're having face-to-face social interactions in shops or socially and so on, like that, the kind of way that my own body somehow feels problematic or potentially problematic, and how to kind of negotiate and be a human person in this kind of space is complicated. And I guess it also comes back to this thing about the kind of choreography of our bodies and how we negotiate that kind of potential. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts about the body.
Yeah, that's interesting. Masumi talks about the, sorry.
No, it's okay, you carry on.
Yeah, it just talks about the emotional register being sort of political, and it's interesting what you say, Hetty, and I think perhaps through all the changes that have happened, we do have this different somatic register that's happening, because we're so that somehow we're really sponging off our relationships. And maybe some less, some more, and those shifts that you're talking about, yeah quite extraordinary. Nice.
I was going to say those negotiations sometimes feel quite clumsy. So it's a clumsy body that's negotiating, because, and yeah, they're kind of trying to preempt what the other person is going to do as well in those interactions.
Absolutely, and you so don't want to judge and weigh that up, but I find it a little bit like, perhaps it's a little bit like rehabilitation after an injury or something, where you know, because I've been going swimming and bicycle riding, but I haven't been walking that much. Well, at first anyway, more now, and actually started to realise, wow, okay, that weight bearing, it's interesting, and other people, like you say, it's quite clumsy. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Sort of, clumsy and out of the zone, out of the zone of practice, perhaps.
I've become aware, sort of what you're talking about, really. I think all of you, those awkward encounters, just a sort of like a series of awkward encounters, and outside in beyond my home where I've been for so long, and being out there. So you talked about negotiating. It's just about, it feels like it's negotiating space in order not to touch.
Yeah, it's quite vital as well. Somehow, it's like, it makes it all the more surprising. It's not disappointing. It's actually quite fun. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but it's quite funny. When you try and go one way with someone and the other way, you know, but somehow that's more delicate now, right? Who goes through the door first, you know, those things. Yeah.
Yeah, and it strikes me there's a kind of different, I mean, at the beginning I so felt like all of this was really temporary, like we sort of just temporarily have to negotiate these things, and now that it seems like this is the way things are now for the foreseeable, there's a kind of it's like requires a whole reconfiguration of kind of thinking, and you know, I think that really strikes me in those really small exchanges, like, oh, this is it now, this is how we you know, have to adapt, and as you say, we kind of rehabilitate and adjust to this new way of doing things, because it isn't a short-term thing.
Yes, and it's sort of played a role in how we receive a parcel and how we touch things and where that touch is. Yeah, I remember watching a film, Contagion, actually not that long ago, and it's incredible, and it's not really one to watch, but yeah, tracing back the origin of where, you know, the disease might have started, you know, and it's just all done in a really speedy clips, you know, to where the hands touched and so on, and frightening. But I find myself doing those kinds of things. It's like, you know, and I noticed it first when I went to get my bike fixed, because the guy who's looking after my bike sprayed everywhere where he thought that I would have touched the bike. So around the seat, the handlebars, the frame. to lift. It's really, people are it's quite an education, actually, those things. So we've become acutely conscious of that.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how we've adapted. I think how, as human beings, and how our bodies have, I mean, we're talking about clumsy negotiations and things, but actually we've adapted really well to this, and quite quickly. The approach, the kind of flexible approach to the adaptation is, it amazes me how that's happened. And when if and when that we come out, the other side of this, then that adaptation, how will that adaptation be as quick, because we've got this new information now of how it is when we can't touch. So but yeah, I've been amazed at how as human beings we've just adapted to this. And while it's not felt necessarily that we've adapted, we adapted quite quickly.
I think there's something about what you're saying, Karen. I'm sort of also thinking, well, have we all been able to adapt? Has it been difficult for some people to adapt? How accessible is that adaptation across the sort of reach of all of us in our different contexts?
Yes, yeah, that is true. I suppose I meant in terms of thinking about distancing and things that, but yes, I mean, it's different with
Yes, we're pretty privileged, really. That's possibly a whole other conversation.
It is really.
Yeah.
That sense, of course, it is a sense. I was using the language of that, that sense of maybe finding ways of replacing or searching through, like you were talking about, Ruth, in terms of sound. Sound has become so important to you. How have we, all of us, not just us, I mean, how have people adapted, as you were talking about, Karen, and maybe it's not consciously looking for replacement of that sense of touch, but maybe that's how we work as human beings, is we just gravitate towards something else that helps us adapt emotionally as well as physically in the context of a lockdown and no touch. Just looking at we've got a few minutes.
And I don't feel like anything can replace the sense of touch. I suppose it's the it's what's making do for the moment.
I've been really drawn to ASMR, which is it's autonomous sensory meridian response, and it's sort of where there's a sort of tingling sensation that comes from response to certain voices and sounds. And there's quite a lot on the internet, and a lot of the people role play, and they'll come towards the camera, so proximity, and they'll enact certain things. It's very interesting because I'm sure it harkens back to possibly when we were very tiny and nestling in our mother's clothes. But that sound of the material and the watching of that as someone receiving ASMR, not everybody receives the tingles. It's a bit like synesthesia in a way, but it literally is like a brain orgasm. I'm sure Lily might cut that. But anyway, and some people get it, and some people have it from when they're at primary school when someone combed their hair. And it makes me think of skin releasing technique and the difference of combing and brushing and tapping. And I've been drawn to that as it's not necessarily a substitute, Karen, for touch, because I know exactly you can't have that. But there's something in that, and I'm sure it's something to do with attention as well. Like, you know, when you're attending to your child, you know, it's your full. The focus is there, and maybe that as adults, that's something in class we might get in a dance class, that attention or from a loved one, and it's not always touch. So yeah, not at touch as skin to skin.
And that was I've been was privileged to witness some work over the last few years with a company that's working on sense of touch with children, often very young children, carers. It's a Wriggle dance company. They all their work is with children, and it just took me back to that. And we talked on one of the previous conversations about self-touch, and is it the same sort of rubbing your own arm, massaging your feet, or touching fabrics? But these children, this was before lockdown, I mean, you could see the delight and the sensations that they were really enjoying in rolling on soft, fluffy textures, holding and crinkling noisy bits of material, walking over brush-like floor mats, doormats in bare feet, and sort of those things that it sort of reminded me, it's different, I think, Ruth, to what you were saying, but it sort of reminded me of those things that we can get sensations of touch through that is not skin to skin.
Yeah, I mean, you can get it from watching, and watching that, yeah, and then hearing those sounds. Similar. Connected.
Different, but
Totally connected.
Children are always good kind of examples to use, I think.
Yeah.
You do see the very kind of, you know, the start of the fascination with touch, and through that using the different sensory materials and things, and then, you know, how that develops, and then their own relation. You know, I see it in my 5-year-old daughter, but how that relationship with touch then develops too, and the need to touch, and not objects as well as people. It's great to see that.
Maybe we've had the chance to rediscover that a little bit in our contexts.
Yeah.
Like understanding an object more through that focus, or that.
I think we're more or less at time. I've sort of 12:45. I think we started about. I write it down somewhere. 12:17. Yeah, but that doesn't mean if anyone's got anything else they really want to share between us that they can't. But otherwise, we could finish there. Is there anything that is bursting to get out?
I just think it's quite strange that we're all smiling and talking like this about touch in these little boxes.
And
it's very, very interesting. Yeah.
Hey, just finish and say thank you so much. It's been really lovely to connect virtually with you, and sad not to hug. We do a virtual hug.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, as well.
And
Thank you.
yeah, we'll meet back with Lily.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay.
See you next time.
Bye. Bye.